The rust-colored eviction notice was a paper ghost haunting the greasy glass of the service bay door. Arthur traced its edges with a calloused finger, the official letterhead a stark, clean intrusion into his world of oil and worn steel. For 40 years, Miller & Son Automotive had been his sanctuary, a name that had become a half-truth after his father passed and a painful memory after his own son, Michael, never returned from Kandahar. Now it was just a liability, a stain on the pristine ledger of Thorn Development. The notice gave him 30 days. He had 7 left. He could feel the town of Harmony Creek holding its breath, watching him. Not with sympathy, but with the detached curiosity of a crowd waiting for a building to be demolished. They saw a relic, a stubborn old man in grease-stained coveralls. Clinging to a past they were eager to pave over with artisanal coffee shops and boutique yoga studios. The dismissal was a quiet, constant hum beneath the town's polite greetings. Humiliation arrived that afternoon in a cloud of dust and arrogance. A gleaming black sedan, silent as a shark, pulled up to the curb. Marcus Thorne stepped out, his suit a sharp, tailored insult to the grit and honesty of the garage. He didn't bother to avoid the puddles of iridescent oil staining the asphalt. He seemed to believe they would retreat from his expensive leather shoes. "Arthur," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with the condescending warmth of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Still here, I see. I thought we had an understanding." Arthur wiped his hands on an already blackened rag, the familiar friction a small comfort. He said nothing. His silence was a wall he had built brick by brick over the years, and it was the only defense he had left. Thorne gestured vaguely at the faded sign, the peeling paint a testament to decades of sun and neglect. "This is just sad. Look at this place. It's a corpse, Arthur. You're just refusing to sign the death certificate." He pulled a sleek leather folio from under his arm. "My final offer is generous, considering I'm buying a memory. 10,000. You can take your tools and walk away with some dignity." The word dignity was a slap. $10,000 for a lifetime's work, for the place where he'd taught his son how to change a tire, for the walls that still echoed with his wife Eleanor's laughter when she'd brought him lunch. It was less than the cost of the sedan Thorne had driven. Across the street, Martha, the owner of the Morning Grind Diner, paused her window washing to watch. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of pity and impatience. Arthur felt the weight of her gaze, and the gazes of others peeking from behind their shop blinds. They were all waiting for him to fold. He finally looked at Thorne, his eyes, the color of faded denim, holding a deep, quiet resolve. "This shop is not for sale." Thorne's smile was a thin, cruel line. "Everything is for sale, Arthur. It's just a matter of price. And yours is getting lower by the day." He tapped the eviction notice on the door. "The bank agrees with me. The town council agrees with me. Progress agrees with me. Who do you have in your corner?" He let the question hang in the air, thick and suffocating as exhaust fumes. Arthur didn't answer. He just turned and walked back into the shadows of his garage, the scent of gasoline and old memories his only allies. The silent roar of Thorne's car pulling away was the sound of the future leaving him behind. The first 30 seconds of his end had begun, and no one, it seemed, was coming to stop it. The conflict wasn't loud. It was a slow, methodical strangulation. Marcus Thorne was a patient predator. The day after his visit, a city inspector appeared, a young man with a clipboard and an apologetic look in his eyes. He spent 3 hours combing through the garage, flagging violations Arthur hadn't known existed. An outdated wiring schematic from 1978. A hairline crack in a non-load-bearing concrete slab. Improper ventilation for paint fumes, though Arthur hadn't painted a car in over a decade. The list of citations was 3 pages long, each one a paper cut bleeding his meager savings dry. The fines totaled more than the value of the rusty pickup truck sitting in the back lot. Thorne was using the system as his weapon, turning the town's own rules into a cudgel to beat Arthur into submission. The cruelty was in its impersonality. Thorne didn't have to get his hands dirty. The bureaucracy would do it for him. A few days later, a new sign appeared overnight, professionally printed and staked into the small patch of grass out front. Future home of the Harmony Creek Plaza. It proclaimed in cheerful, optimistic font, a glossy rendering of a sterile, glass-fronted building superimposed over a ghosted image of his garage. It was an erasure. Thorne wasn't just trying to evict him. He was trying to delete him from the town's history before he was even gone. People walking by would glance at the sign, then at Arthur, their expressions a mix of awkwardness and forward-looking acceptance. They had already moved on. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting a property that no longer felt like his. The denial of his worth was absolute. He wasn't a man who had served his community for 4 decades. He was an impediment, a wrinkle on a blueprint. Thorne escalated. He hired a local crew to begin surveying the adjacent properties. The sharp, percussive thud of their hammers and the grating whine of their power saws became the soundtrack to Arthur's dwindling days. They never spoke to him, never even looked his way, acting as if the garage were already an empty lot. One morning, Arthur found a pile of construction debris, splintered 2x4s and broken drywall, dumped just inside his property line, a deliberate and petty act of territorial aggression. He spent the morning clearing it himself, his back aching, his hands raw. He saw Martha watching from her diner window again, a frown creasing her brow, but she didn't come out. No one did. Their silence was a form of consent. They were complicit in his slow demise, choosing the path of least resistance, eager for the revitalization Thorne promised. The tension was a physical presence, a tightness in his chest that never eased. He felt profoundly, utterly alone, a single stubborn stone against which a relentless tide was breaking. The pressure was designed to make him feel worthless, to convince him that his fight was not just futile but foolish. He was a man out of time, and Thorne was the clock, its ticking a countdown to his extinction. His quiet strength was rooted in soil much deeper than the concrete floor of his garage. It was forged in the humid jungles of Vietnam, where survival depended not on noise but on stillness, on observing, on enduring. It was tempered by the love of his wife, Eleanor. He remembered the day they'd bought the garage. It was a derelict shell then, but she had seen the potential. "It has good bones, Art," she'd said, her hand in his, her optimism a light that could pierce any gloom. They had rebuilt it together, board by board. He'd handled the structural work, the grease and the grime, while she had brought the life. A fresh coat of blue paint on the shutters, a window box overflowing with geraniums, a pot of coffee always brewing for customers who often became friends. The sign, Miller and Son, had been her idea, a promise for a future with a son they hadn't even had yet. When Michael was born, the garage became his playground, the scent of motor oil his first memory. Arthur could still see him, a small boy with Eleanor's bright eyes, trying to lift a wrench almost as big as he was. Losing them had happened in waves. First Michael, his life given for a cause Arthur struggled to understand, his flag-draped coffin of final, terrible silence. Then Eleanor, 2 years later, not to a sudden blow but to a slow, cruel wasting disease that stole her breath and then her light. After she was gone, the garage was all he had left. It wasn't just a building. It was a mausoleum of love and loss. Every grease stain on the floor told a story. Every dent in the workbench was a memory. The faded photograph tacked to the corkboard, a young Arthur in uniform, his arm around a smiling Michael in his little league outfit, was his sacred text. His principles were simple, forged in loss and loyalty. You finish what you start. You treat people with respect not because of who they are, but because of who you are. And you don't surrender your ground, especially when that ground is all that's left of your heart. Thorne saw a rundown building on a valuable piece of land. He couldn't see the ghosts. He couldn't see the love, the sacrifice, the history embedded in the very walls. Arthur wasn't just fighting for a piece of property. He was fighting for the honor of his dead, for the quiet dignity of a life spent building something that was meant to last. This silent resilience was his inheritance, a legacy of quiet endurance against the loud, hollow promises of men like Thorne. The pressure mounted, becoming a physical force. Thorne, impatient with the slow grind of bureaucracy, sent 2 men to expedite things. They weren't construction workers. They moved with a coiled, predatory energy, their eyes cold and empty. They parked their unmarked van across the street and just sat there for a day, watching. It was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to fray his nerves, to make him feel hunted. The community saw them. They walked a little faster past his garage, their eyes fixed firmly ahead. The silence of his neighbors was no longer passive. It felt like an active betrayal. They chose the comfort of ignorance over the risk of solidarity. The following night, the vandals came. It wasn't overt destruction. It was small, insidious acts of violation. A line of thick, black tar poured across the entrance to his service bay. The locks on his doors filled with superglue. A rock, wrapped in a note that read "Last Chance," thrown through the small office window. Arthur found the shattered glass at dawn. He swept it up with methodical calm, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't call the police. He knew it would be useless. There were no witnesses. The 2 men in the van were long gone. It was his word against Thorne's, and his word, he knew, was worth nothing in this new version of Harmony Creek. He felt a profound weariness settle into his bones, a despair so heavy it was hard to breathe. He sat on an old metal stool, the broken window letting in the cold morning air, and looked at the photograph of his wife and son. He was failing them. The fortress he had guarded for so long was being breached, and he was too old, too tired, too alone to fight back effectively. He endured it. He chiseled the glue out of the locks, scraped the tar from the pavement, and taped a piece of cardboard over the broken window. Each act was a small defiance, a refusal to be broken. But inside he was cracking. The community's continued silence was the hammer. They saw the tar, they saw the boarded-up window, and they said nothing. Their averted gazes were a verdict. He was on his own. The crisis was no longer just about his property. It was about his spirit. Thorne wasn't just trying to take his land. He was trying to take his hope. And as he sat there in the encroaching gloom, he feared Thorne was finally winning. It was late afternoon, the sky bruised purple with an impending storm, when the sound of a dying engine sputtered through the quiet street. A thunderous roar choked, coughed, and then fell silent. Arthur looked up from the engine he was half-heartedly tinkering with to see a motorcycle coasting to a stop directly in front of his bay door. It was a beast of a machine, a heavily customized Harley-Davidson, all gleaming chrome and black steel. The man riding it was just as formidable. He was huge, a mountain of muscle and leather, with a long braided beard and a Hell's Angels death head patch stitched prominently on the back of his cut. Tattoos snaked up his neck and disappeared into a weathered, grim face. He swung a leg over the bike, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He kicked the frame in frustration, a curse rumbling in his chest like distant thunder. He looked around, his eyes scanning the street with open hostility, finally landing on Arthur's garage. He stomped over, his expression a mask of pure menace. "You open?" he growled, his voice a gravelly rasp. Arthur simply nodded, wiping his hands on his rag. The man jerked a thumb toward his silent machine. "It just died. Won't start. I need to get to Reno." Any other mechanic might have seen the man's patch, his size, his temper, and claimed to be closed for the day. Any other man, especially one with Arthur's troubles, would have refused. He had no money for parts, no energy for a difficult customer. But Arthur saw something else. He saw a man stranded, a traveler whose journey had been interrupted. He saw the machine, not the man, and the machine was in trouble. "Push it in," Arthur said, his voice quiet but steady. The biker, surprised by the simple, unconditional acceptance, grunted and wheeled the massive bike into the bay. Arthur spent the next 3 hours working. The storm broke outside, rain lashing against the tin roof, but inside the garage, there was only the quiet, focused sound of tools and labor. The problem was complex, a fried stator and a faulty voltage regulator. It was a job that would normally cost hundreds of dollars in parts and labor. Arthur had to cannibalize parts from an old generator he kept in the back, meticulously rebuilding the components with the skill and patience of a surgeon. The biker watched him the entire time, silent and intense. He saw the way Arthur's hands, though gnarled with arthritis, moved with an unerring grace and certainty. He saw the care Arthur took not to scratch the chrome, the respect he gave the machine. He saw the boarded-up window and the eviction notice on the door. He saw a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders who was still willing to help a stranger. When Arthur finally finished, he wiped the last bit of grease from the engine casing and stood back. "She's ready," he said. The biker hit the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, throaty rumble that filled the garage with power and life. He let it idle for a moment, listening, a slow nod of approval on his face. He cut the engine and pulled out a thick wad of cash from his vest. "How much?" Arthur shook his head. He looked from the biker to the rain-streaked eviction notice. His own problems felt immense, but in that moment they also felt secondary. "Nothing," he said. The biker stared, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, nothing? That was hours of work." "Good work," Arthur shrugged. A small, weary movement. "You're on the road. A man on the road needs his machine. Just get where you're going safely." It was a simple statement of principle, an act of selfless dignity in the face of his own ruin. He was sharing the only thing he had left. His skill, his kindness, with someone who needed it, expecting nothing in return. The biker stood there for a long moment, the cash still in his hand, studying the old mechanic. He finally stuffed the money back into his vest. He didn't say thank you. He just looked Arthur square in the eye and gave a single, sharp nod. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. Then he climbed on his bike and roared off into the rain-swept darkness. The next morning, the gossip in the morning grind diner was thicker than the coffee. Martha, refilling mugs with a clatter of ceramic, had seen the entire exchange from her front window. She had watched the terrifying biker arrive, had seen the lights in Arthur's garage stay on long after every other business had closed, and had witnessed the biker leaving without any apparent trouble. She hadn't heard the conversation, but she had seen Arthur refuse the money. "He fixed that monster's bike for free," she told Mr. Henderson from the hardware store, her voice a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "The man looked like he'd tear you in half for looking at him wrong, and Arthur just helped him, and then shook his head when the fella tried to pay Henderson, a man who believed in the sanctity of a balanced ledger, scoffed. More likely the biker threatened him. Old Art's probably too scared to even file a police report. He's losing it, letting that property go to ruin and now giving away his labor." But Martha wasn't so sure. She had seen Arthur's posture. It wasn't fear. It was resolve. A quiet, unshakable dignity she hadn't noticed before. The story spread through the small cluster of shops that made up Harmony Creek's town square. The narrative began to shift subtly at first. The image of Arthur as a stubborn old fool was being challenged by a new one, Arthur as a man of quiet, perhaps foolish principle. Whispers followed the mailman on his route. People who had once looked past Arthur now glanced at his garage with a flicker of curiosity. They saw the taped-up window not just as a sign of decay, but as evidence of the pressure he was under. They saw the newly scraped tar patch on his driveway. They had all seen Thorne's men, the silent, intimidating figures in the van. Before, they had mentally filed it under "none of my business." Now, they connected it to the story of the biker. The community's perception, a monolithic block of indifference, began to develop hairline fractures. They had judged him for his refusal to sell, seeing it as an obstacle to their own potential prosperity. But his selfless act towards a complete stranger, an intimidating one at that, didn't fit their narrative. It suggested a moral code that transcended profit and loss, something many of them had long since compromised. Their assumptions were being subtly re-examined. They didn't rush to his side, not yet. Fear of Thorne was still a powerful deterrent. But the seeds of respect had been planted. They watched him that day working alone in his garage, and for the first time they weren't just waiting for him to fail. They were wondering what he would do next. The silent judgment was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being replaced by a grudging, nascent respect. It began as a low rumble, a distant vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It was just after 10 in the morning, a time when Harmony Creek was at its quietest. Martha looked up from her counter, frowning. Mr. Henderson paused with a box of nails halfway to a shelf. The vibration grew, deepening into a guttural growl that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Then they appeared. Over the rise at the edge of town, a wave of steel and chrome crested the hill. Two abreast, they came, a disciplined, thundering column of motorcycles. The sound was overwhelming, a mechanical roar that shook the windows of the shops and rattled the very foundations of the town's complacency. They were Hell's Angels. Not one or two but dozens. They poured into the town square, their engines a deafening chorus of controlled power. The town froze. People on the sidewalks stopped dead, their faces pale with shock and fear. Cars pulled over, their drivers staring with wide eyes. This wasn't a parade. It was an occupation. At the head of the column was the biker Arthur had helped, the mountain of a man on the perfectly tuned Harley. He led his brothers with an unnerving calm, his eyes sweeping over the town as if he were a general surveying a battlefield. They didn't stop at the diner or the hardware store. They moved with a singular purpose, flowing like a river of black leather and steel until they reached their destination. Miller and Son Automotive, they formed a perfect, intimidating semicircle around the garage, 67 bikes in all, their engines idling in a deep, menacing symphony. They cut their engines in unison, and the sudden, shocking silence was even more terrifying than the noise had been. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal. From his office across the street, Marcus Thorne watched from his panoramic window, a smug smirk spreading across his face. He saw the leather cuts, the patches, the grim-faced riders. His assumption was immediate and satisfying. The old fool had gotten himself into trouble with a biker gang. Perhaps he'd botched the repair, and they had come for retribution. Thorne leaned back in his chair, ready to watch the final violent demolition of Arthur Miller's life. He thought, with no small amount of pleasure, that this would save him the trouble of a legal eviction. The Brotherhood had arrived, but for the terrified onlookers and the gleeful antagonist, they were not redeemers. They were executioners. The lead biker, the one Arthur knew only as a stranded traveler, swung his leg off his bike. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace toward the open bay door where Arthur stood, frozen, a wrench dangling from his hand. The biker's name was Roadog, president of the Reno chapter, a title that carried more weight in his world than any corporate CEO. He stopped a few feet from Arthur, the sheer size of him blocking out the morning light. The rest of the bikers dismounted, standing by their machines, a silent, watchful army. Their collective gaze was fixed on the small garage. The town held its breath. Thorne watched, anticipating a punch, a threat, a final, brutal confrontation. But Roadog did something no one expected. He reached into his vest and pulled out an envelope thick with cash. He held it out to Arthur. "The brothers and I took up a collection," he said, his gravelly voice carrying in the heavy silence. "For the parts. And the labor. We always pay our debts." Arthur just stared at the envelope, then at the man's face. He shook his head. "I told you. No charge." Roadog's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, respect, understanding, warmed his eyes. "I know what you said, but the code is the code." He looked past Arthur, his gaze falling on the faded photograph of the young soldier and the little boy. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Who's the soldier?" he asked, his tone shifting. "My son, Michael," Arthur said, his voice thick with a grief that never aged. "He fell in Kandahar. 101st Airborne." A ripple went through the ranks of the bikers. A few of them murmured to each other. Another biker, older, with a graying beard and the hard eyes of a man who had seen his own wars, stepped forward. His name was Shepard, and he had been a door gunner in Nam. He walked into the garage and peered at the photo. Then he looked at a smaller, framed commendation hanging beside it, one Arthur had never taken down. Shepard's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Roadog, his voice rough with emotion. "Sergeant Arthur Miller." Silver Star recipient. Battle of Ia Drang Valley. The revelation fell into the silence like a thunderclap. Thorn, watching from his window, felt his smirk vanish. The onlookers, who had only seen a failing mechanic, were stunned. Arthur wasn't just an old man. He was a hero, a warrior from a forgotten war. Roadog looked from the photo to Arthur, seeing him clearly for the first time. He wasn't just a kind mechanic. He was one of them, a brother forged in a different kind of fire. "My old man was an Ia Drang," Roadog said, his voice low and filled with a new, profound respect. "He never made it home, the truth was out." Arthur's quiet dignity wasn't born of weakness or stubbornness. It was the ingrained discipline of a soldier, the quiet honor of a man who had sacrificed more than any of them could imagine. The bikers weren't there for retribution. They were there to honor a debt, and they had just discovered it was far deeper than a simple motorcycle repair. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The bikers, who had been a silent, intimidating force, now moved with purpose. Roadog turned to his men. "This man is one of us," he declared, his voice booming across the square. "This place," he swept a hand toward the garage, "is protected ground." The statement was not a suggestion. It was a decree. It was aimed directly at Thorn's office window. A half-dozen bikers, the largest and most menacing among them, formed a line at the edge of Arthur's property, facing Thorn's building. They didn't do anything. They just stood there, arms crossed, their leather-clad presence a living wall, a declaration of sovereignty. The rest of the men got to work. It was a stunning, surreal sight. The Hell's Angels, figures of fear and folklore, transformed into a high-efficiency construction crew. Shepard, who owned a contracting business in his other life, started directing them. They descended on the garage like a disciplined platoon. A group of them tore the cardboard from the broken window and meticulously replaced the entire pane of glass. Another crew produced power washers from a support truck that had quietly pulled up and began blasting away decades of grime from the garage's facade, revealing the clean, strong brickwork beneath. Someone produced ladders and cans of paint. Within an hour, the faded, peeling trim was being painted a crisp, clean white, the shutters a deep, dignified blue. The same color Eleanor had chosen all those years ago. They didn't just fix the damage Thorn's men had done. They began to restore the entire building. They patched the roof, repaved the cracked asphalt in front of the bay, and even weeded the small, neglected flower box under the window. Arthur stood, overwhelmed, as they swarmed his life's work, not to destroy it, but to rebuild it, to honor it. Martha came out of the diner, her face a mask of awe, carrying a tray loaded with coffee mugs. She walked right up to the line of intimidating bikers and offered them coffee. They accepted with quiet, polite nods. Soon others followed. Mr. Henderson arrived with a box of donuts. The local baker appeared with fresh bread. The community, shamed by their silence and inspired by this unexpected display of loyalty, began to bridge the gap they had allowed to form. The ultimate act of recognition came from Roadog himself. He walked back to Arthur, holding a brand-new leather cut, identical to his own but without any patches. In his other hand, he held a single, custom-stitched patch. It wasn't the death head of the club. It was a simple design, 2 crossed wrenches overlaying a silver star. "This is for you," Roadog said, his voice heavy with sincerity. He handed the vest to Arthur. "It means you're under our protection. You in this shop. No one will ever mess with you again." Arthur took the vest, the weight of the leather a solid, comforting presence. It was more than a gift. It was an anointing. It was a symbol that he was no longer alone. The bikers, and now the community, had finally recognized his worth, not for what he could provide them, but for the man he had always been. The closure was not loud, but a series of quiet, powerful images that lingered long after the roar of the engines faded. Marcus Thorn did not appear again. His black sedan was gone from its reserved spot the next morning. The future home sign was gone too, pulled from the earth and snapped in two, left by the curb like common trash. The silent wall of bikers had spoken a language he understood perfectly. This ground was no longer for sale. The town itself seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, waking from a long, selfish slumber. The transformation was palpable. People no longer averted their eyes when they passed Arthur's garage. They waved. They stopped to chat. They brought him their business, not out of pity, but out of a deep, abiding respect. The garage, once a symbol of decay, became the heart of the community, a testament to resilience. Its fresh paint and clean windows gleamed in the sun. Martha planted new geraniums in the window box, their bright red blossoms a splash of vibrant life. Arthur never wore the leather cut. He hung it on the wall in his office right next to the photograph of Eleanor and Michael. It was a holy trinity of his life. His love, his loss, and his newfound legion of guardian angels. He didn't need to wear it. The protection it signified was now woven into the fabric of the town. The sight of a lone motorcycle passing through Harmony Creek no longer caused a flicker of fear. It brought a sense of peace. The sound of a Harley engine was no longer a threat. It was a reminder of the day loyalty, honor, and brotherhood roared into town and saved one of their own. The final, lingering image was of Arthur, standing in the open bay of his restored shop at dusk. He was wiping down a tool, his movements unhurried, content. A young boy from down the street was watching him, mesmerized, the way Michael once had. Arthur smiled and beckoned him closer, ready to show him how an engine works. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own life. He was a pillar, a quiet landmark of dignity secured. The 67 bikers had left, but their presence remained. They had not just rebuilt a garage. They had restored a man's soul and reminded a town of its own. The quiet hum of the street, the scent of fresh coffee from the diner, the distant rumble of a passing truck. It was all part of a harmony he had thought was lost forever. He was home and he was not alone. The roar had given way to a respectful, enduring quiet.